for you who attended the dinner hosted by Korea have enjoyed the dinner, and who had other activities have enjoyed their activities. Happy to see you all here on time. Apologies for starting 15 minutes late. I know that we'll be starting today with breakout groups, so just try to make sure that we have critical mass, so when we break out, we have enough people in the breakout groups. As what we did yesterday, the icebreaker thing, the Standing Committee on Finance and the Secretariat, we want to make sure that everybody is enjoying their time and they have enjoyed their stay here. So I think there are 4 questions. I think that people have to go through this poll EV to answer. I don't know if they're going to put them on the screen or not. I think that was yesterday, or this is already people have started connecting. As they did yesterday, did you guys have a good night's sleep? Of course, this is not related to the SCF, but I think it's related to the hotels, but I'm sure that I hope that everybody had good night's sleep. For those of you who are not attending the GCF, for those of you who have attended the GCF, I hope that you had good dreams, and there was no nightmares yesterday. What did you have for breakfast? For those of you who get breakfast, so I think this is fruits, eggs, bacon, sausages, halal beef for you who do the halal thing. And the third question, what is your professional background? I think this is important for us in the analysis of the attendees. So this is an important question to answer. What, Richard, you're not able to access? No? It's intended. And then the fourth question, which is a very important question, it's an open question. When it comes to the first question, hold on, what is your takeaway keyword from yesterday's forum? And this is an important one. I would, of course, like to add a 5th question, but it is not on the poll, and it should not be answered. Did you talk to your partner last night who is not attending here? It's important. We need to keep the family communication. For many of us who are traveling long distances, or others who are leaving their partners during holidays. So this is for you, Peter. Okay, having done this part of breaking the ice, the icebreaker thing, let's go into business. Let's start our business for today. Just a brief recap of what we had yesterday. Yesterday, we had a focused discussion on the global finance architecture with 3 main clusters: the overview of climate finance, the state of climate funds, and bilateral and the multilateral ones, and the new climate instruments. As we were working, Peter and myself, and preparing for this together with the Standing Committee on Finance colleagues, the idea was to have a focus day on the international scene, and the second day would be on the national scene. And it is important that in this second day, where we are going to deal with elements of the global financial architecture from the perspective of the national and subnational entities, it is important that we get, I hope, very good feedbacks and from the breakout groups, because through that we will know the challenges and the lessons learned in establishing national funds for the countries who have established those funds, and we'll get the experiences in the development of climate investment plans. I would just say that some of the funds, like the GCF, issue of having plans and programs is of crucial importance, because it gives an indication on how the country is moving forward and how the perspective and the vision of the country in preparing itself to take its role in effectively tackling climate change while also enhancing sustainable development. And the third item, which is of importance to us who are in the SCF and to many of us, which is issue of accessing of the international climate finance. Just very briefly, this is an element that many developing country representatives have brought forward during the negotiations. It was reflected in the outcomes of the climate change negotiations. The workshops that are being done under the UNFCCC on long-term finance is dealing with the issue, which is, I think, it's very important issue because it relates to several elements in the national planning, in preparation, and also to ensure that countries get the support needed to enhance their national actions. Not support needed to do something, but support needed to enhance the action. And in many cases, accessibility is a way that some of us can convince their policymakers and the decision takers back home that yes, there are funds, yes, there is a lot of money, a lot of finance that is available there, and yes, we can access it. So that third question is always very important. In the afternoon today, we will be focusing on the climate finance governance at the national level. And this is another important element. Yesterday, when we were putting forward the numbers and the figures and everything, one of the elements that was identified by the Standing Committee on Finance in the BA, in the biannual assessment, is we don't have enough information coming from the recipients, coming from the beneficiaries, coming from the developing countries. So how can we enhance the experience in establishing the coordination mechanisms across the board? And I think we'll be listening to a lot of experiences and ideas. And when we say establishing mechanism, the mechanism is not only for governments, but it is cross-cutting stakeholder mechanism. So it has everybody. It has the government and the non-governmental stakeholders. And then the second element that we'll be discussing will be the role of the national and subnational stakeholders in designing and implementing projects and programs. It is an important element. It is very clear in the policies of the different funds, be it the GCF, Adaptation Fund, and others. There is a strong emphasis of the role of stakeholders in the designing and the implementation. And the role is not only a monitoring role, but also take their views into consideration. It's the communities and the stakeholders who really get the sense and the feeling of what is needed, what should we be focusing on in preparing and designing the programs and the projects. And I think this is a very important element that we'll be tackling. The third point, which is the insights gained from supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. And using, of course, the funds. SMEs has been, it's like the new trend. Everybody's talking about SMEs. The thing is, when you start dealing with SMEs, how can we enhance the establishment and the functioning of the SMEs and allow them to shift from one level to another? I mean, shifting from a very small entity to a bigger entity, building on, expanding, having their activities enhanced, and this is a very important element, at least in my country, in Egypt. There are a lot of policies that are put in place, and usually there is a problem that faces the SMEs once they shift from being small enterprises into medium enterprises, and I think this is something that we'll be listening to experiences on that. So at the end of the day today, we hope that we'll have the shared views to build robust national climate finance architecture. This is important. And to identify the challenges that is needed to resolve the flows, to unlock the flows of finance from the international level to the national level, and how relevant actors are coordinating and collaborating together to establish this architecture and make sure that it is effective, functioning, and delivering. Having said that, I think our idea today was to start the day with the breakout groups. So that's why we took like 15 minutes. We were late, so to make sure that enough people are in the room, as this is a national level issue, and as my colleague Lando from the Secretariat said, then we start bottom up. We start with the breakout groups, and then we have a plenary. So we're starting with the breakout groups, the bottom-up approach. We'll have 3 breakout groups, as yesterday. The first one will be the mobilization of climate finance at the national and subnational level. It will be here in the plenary, led by Margaret Kim from GGGI. And the second one, assessing climate finance and the capacity building. It's breakout group room one downstairs, led by Saliha from Adaptation Fund. And the third one will be the budgetary planning and devising climate investment plans. And this will be breakout room 2, led by Dudi from Indonesia. We will reconvene here at 10:30, so we have almost a little bit more than 1 hour in the plenary to to hear your reports back with a session that will be moderated by Philip Bush from the Bahamas. Having said that, I think my notes end here. So I wish you good breakout groups, enjoy the breakout groups, and we'll be looking forward to hearing some very constructive ideas coming out that will help us not only here or the SCF, but as practitioners and as people who are working in the negotiations on ground and taking experience forward. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and we'll see you at 10:30 here. Thank you. I'm enjoying this mic thing. It's very interesting.
Good morning. Shall we start? Ladies and gentlemen in the back, if you want to sit up front, that would help. I have really bad eyesight, so I can't really see you when you raise your hands. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name's Margaret Kim. I go by Maggie, so please call me Maggie when you see me in the corridors. I'm from the Global Green Growth Institute, leading on all the Green Climate Fund-related activities, including readiness, PPFs, and funding proposal support. So it's a great pleasure to moderate this session. So today, this session will focus on national and subnational financing mechanisms, including the national fund. So what are the challenges, lessons learned from establishing a national fund, maintaining it, managing it, and mobilizing, capitalizing the national funds, and see what the country experiences are like, and hope to come with good discussions at the end of the session. So without a further ado, let me introduce our colleague Julian Xavier. I said it wrong, from the Cambodia Climate Change Alliance Trust Fund, to give his view and his experiences in establishing the fund and also managing the fund. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie, for the introduction, and good morning to you all. So let me maybe start with a disclaimer. I help manage this fund called the Cambodia Climate Change Alliance, which is a UN trust fund in Cambodia. And let me start by saying that Cambodia doesn't have a traditional national climate fund, but I'll say a few words about the history behind this and why the choice was made to go with a UN trust fund for now. And then I'll talk a bit also at the end about Cambodia's experience with subnational funds and how they integrate climate change into the subnational funds that they have for communes and districts. So let me start with CCCA and the whole discussion on national funds in Cambodia. This whole discussion started around 2010, 2011. And what the government did at that time was with support from the UN, they did a review of the various donors that were out there and what their positions were towards the National Climate Fund. And some of the key elements that came out of that review are that, one, Cambodia is still an LDC, a relatively weak public financial management systems, although it's improving. And so you had very few donors willing to provide funds through government systems, even a separate fund. Only the EU, I think, was willing to potentially do that, if I remember well. So the prospects for additional resource mobilization through a fund in the context of Cambodia, I'm not saying this applies to all countries, but in the context of Cambodia, the prospects for additional resource mobilizations were relatively low. And the major climate change donors clearly preferred a bilateral approach and a project approach in that context. So that was one of the issues. Another question that was on the back of the government's mind was whether they wanted to put the emphasis on mainstreaming in national systems from the start, or having a separate channel for climate funds. And there was a fear, especially from the people in charge of the climate change response, which in Cambodia there's an interministerial council called the National Council for Sustainable Development. And they were afraid that this could create a silo kind of approach with dedicated projects and people working purely on climate change, and that this could work against their mainstreaming agenda. But at the same time, people saw that there was an opening to still pool funds, but specifically for technical assistance on the climate change response and for kind of bottom-up innovative projects. So this is what the trust fund that I help manage focuses on. So it's a smaller fund. At the moment, we have a total of about 25 million that have been contributed, and we're in the middle of replenishment, so this is likely to rise to 40 million, and we've been operating for about 5 years. So it's a relatively small fund, but we help to pool funds for technical assistance and we also have a financing facility for innovative projects. Our donors at the moment are the EU, Sweden, and UNDP. Denmark was also a donor in the past, but they pulled out of Cambodia, so they're not with us anymore. A few words maybe on how we operate. So it's a UN trust fund, but it's managed under a national implementation modality. So it's managed by the National Council for Sustainable Development. I'm based there. As much as possible, the procedures of the government are used with some additional safeguards from the UN. And so it's the level of ownership of the fund is very, very strong in the National Council for Sustainable Development. Some lessons learned on the more practical aspects of managing the fund. One of the issues we had to grapple with was, of course, who can access the funds. And we started with kind of a competitive mechanism that was open to all, so calls for proposals, civil society could apply, government could apply. This worked, and we got some really good projects out of that, but at the same time, there were also complaints from the government partners that this wasn't entirely fair to them, because some of the NGOs could bring in external capacity to prepare proposals, which the government couldn't, and so they felt it wasn't really a level playing field out there. So then what we've done in the second phase of our calls for proposals is we've had some funds earmarked for priority government, for priority sectors, and that could be accessed by government entities only. And we still kept a window open for which all types of entities could access, except the private sector. But I can come back to that. But civil society can still access our funds. So this helped. The positive aspects of this is that for the government, it has helped to build capacity. So it requires a lot of support from our side at the design stage, because again, specifically in the context of Cambodia, this may be different in countries that are at a more advanced stage of development, but in the context of Cambodia, there's real capacity issues in a number of ministries. So it requires a lot of support upfront from the Cambodia Climate Change Alliance staff to help with the design of the projects. And because it's not a competitive modality for the government, then we're able to do that, to be more involved in the design. Of course, as soon as you have a competitive modality, you have to be a bit hands-off, and so that's one of the positive elements, and it has helped. And I'll talk about one specific success story at the end, but it has helped build capacity in government to then develop proposals for larger projects and to access other sources of financing. We're also kind of filling a gap in the financing architecture, because there's not much financing available for this kind of bottom-up initiatives. Again, maybe Cambodia specific. It would be interesting to hear from you how it is in your countries, but both from the government side, from the civil society side, and also from private sector, we hear that they just don't know where to access the seed funding that they need for the ideas that they have about innovative approaches to adaptation or mitigation. And so that kind of facility available at country level, relatively open. We have some sectoral priorities, but we try to keep it relatively open. Then that helps to fill a gap in the financing architecture, I think. We started with a big focus on adaptation, again in line with the national priorities in Cambodia. But over time, and as Cambodia also submitted its NDC, made its first commitment in relation to mitigation, then we've gradually opened the fund also to mitigation projects. And the objective for the next phase is maybe 60-40, 60% adaptation, 40% mitigation. And as I said, one of the key aspects of one of the key objectives for the fund is to help to prepare successful projects or entities for scaling up, accessing larger sources of finance, whether it's through the national budget, so domestic financing from the national budget, and we work a lot with the Ministry of Finance, or international finance, obviously, Green Climate Fund and the like. Some of the challenges we faced, they are linked to the broader aid architecture in the country. So we are supported mostly by European donors who are willing to pool funds and have kind of multilateral approaches as well with the UN. Some of the big players in climate change financing in the country are still favor bilateral approaches. So we have some issues with parallel initiatives on for example, when on the technical assistance side of our work, when we help to build national monitoring and evaluation systems or things like this, there are issues with some parallel initiatives, and not everybody comes around the table to coordinate. From the government side, the feedback is very positive. They've asked for this initiative to be renewed. As I mentioned, there's a very strong level of ownership, and they feel it provides them a platform to then engage those partners that are not involved in the trust fund. A few words about one specific project which we supported in the first round in our first call, as part of our first call for proposal, and which links to the topic of subnational finance. So for the subnational level, it's a bit a similar approach in Cambodia. They didn't want to go for a separate climate fund for subnational entities. But what they have, and they've had these funds in place for 10, 15 years, are what they call the Commune Songkat Fund and the District Municipality Fund. So they have two funds that are dedicated to part of the government, funded by donors and the government budget, but entirely managed by government, and which support the communes and the districts at the subnational level with development finance. And so one of our first projects with the entity in charge of those funds was to help build within that kind of a top-up financing facility with climate finance for climate-related projects. And this was done in partnership with UNCDF as well, providing the technical assistance. And it's been very, very successful. They've now expanded this to, I think, 4 provinces now in Cambodia. This entity is going for accreditation with the Green Climate Fund, hopefully at the next board if things go well. And they're looking for Green Climate Fund money in addition to the government funds to scale up this facility. So that's an example of how we've helped to build that capacity to bring climate finance down to the local level in the case of Cambodia. But also there, not through a dedicated climate fund, but rather through mainstreaming climate change in existing government systems. Yeah, and maybe I don't want to take too much time, but on the private sector side, this is one area where Cambodia is definitely interested in having a dedicated structure for climate change finance. We're still at a very, very early stage. There are some capacity issues with the local banks. We don't have a very strong public development bank in Cambodia. There's one structure, but it's not very strong. And also the size of the market is relatively small. It's a country with 15, 16 million people. But they are definitely looking into that. But it's still at an early stage. But this is one area where there may be a dedicated climate change fund in the near future. So that's it for me. But I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Julien. So is there any immediate questions to Julien before I open the discussion with the questions? No? Okay, so, oh, yes.
Thanks very much. So Dominic Malloy from the UK. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. A couple of quick questions. So one is that, I mean, this idea of support being focused on technical assistance and capacity building from the UK side, it's something we're looking at more and more as we learn about how best to kind of provide climate support. So we're really looking into this. And you mentioned the support was potentially mostly targeted at civil society, or, well, I was just going to ask a bit more information on how the projects and the support filtered through to the public sector and government, and whether there was a kind of, in terms of the sustainability of the programs, whether it had an impact on policy or the institutions going forward. And then a second quick question, an interesting point on the potential lack of coordination between the bilateral support and the fund itself, and maybe just to get your thoughts as we're talking about the kind of the setup of the climate finance architecture on what are the pros and cons of supporting via a national development fund as opposed to that bilateral support. Thanks.
Okay. So on the support, we mostly support government projects at the moment. Maybe I wasn't clear enough. We have these two funding channels, one that is more open and where it's a mix of government and civil society, and one that is dedicated to government. So most of our projects are with the public sector. And we work a lot on the sustainability strategies. And in the case of Cambodia, it started with a relatively small budget, but it's growing very fast. Economic growth in Cambodia is 7% a year, and the budget is growing 15 to 20% a year, with additional revenue collection, etc. So it's now a significant amount of money, and the role of ODA is much smaller than what it used to be. So we work a lot with our government projects on talking to the Ministry of Finance if they have successful approaches and trying to integrate that in their investment plan, in their budgets, and then making the link with Ministry of Finance to make sure they get the financing that they need. So definitely that's one of our main areas of focus. The second question was on, I lost it now. The relationship with the bilaterals. Actually, it's not just the bilaterals. I don't want to name names, but we have some big multilateral development banks also involved in the country. And one of the issues is that if they manage the trust fund, then it's fine. They're willing to coordinate. If they are not in charge of the trust fund, it's very difficult to get those players to come to the table. And they've got tens of millions, hundreds of millions in the case of Cambodia, so they're a very big player. So it's difficult for a government that has, I guess in many LDCs, relatively lower levels of capacity. So to assert themselves and really be truly in the lead, bringing all the partners to the table. That's something we try to do because it's part of our mandate to strengthen government to play that role. But it's not always easy. And you can also have cases where donors will, they may have strong links to certain ministries in government. So you also have this issue of, it's easier for them to go through the usual channels than to also coordinate through the climate change channels. So you may have a case of kind of the existing pipeline gets topped up with climate finance, but in terms of addressing the top climate change priorities of the country, there are discussions there. So I think for us, really, the solution to this is to really empower the national government to play that role. I mean, it's not our role to coordinate the donors. But in the case of a country like Cambodia, it's a process that will take some time. And we see the same dynamics in the GCF programming process. We've seen, the way it's supposed to be is that the government, national stakeholders define priorities, then decide who they work with on specific priorities. In reality, I think in many countries we've seen it's not really the way it's happening, that you have donors coming with projects that are already in their pipeline and trying to push to get that approved and funded by the GCF. So I think there's no quick fix to this, but we have to keep working on building national capacities to truly be in the lead to address those issues.
Before we get to the second question, I think we're already getting into this discussion. So let me pose some of the guiding questions for our discussion. So we would love to hear about what are some of the challenges and lessons learned in establishing national funds. If you're from the countries, it would be great to get your views on that. For example, how do we keep national funds operational from both management and financial perspectives? If it's a short-term setup, then how do we mainstream it? How do we make it longer term? How do we mobilize more finances into the fund? And how do we develop criteria to access these funds from national and subnational perspective? What are the challenges there and lessons learned? And secondly, what support is available out there to operationalize this and mainstream this? So having those questions in mind, I'll get to the questions. So we'll take about 2 to 3 questions, and then, yes, first.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Unadia, GCF NDA from Burkina Faso. I would like to touch on the issue of country ownership. You said that for the project or for the management of the fund, the ownership, the country ownership is really effective. So now my question is, as far as the fund itself is concerned, is there any national contribution, financial contribution to the fund or not, in terms of ownership? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Evans. I'm from Malawi. I negotiate climate finance for the LDCs. I have a question and a comment. The question is, how do you divide or draw the line in terms of reporting? You mentioned that you have Sweden and German or the other country, and then you have UNDP. So when they report those in their country reports, and of course UNDP in their report on the overflows international, and then it comes to Cambodia, maybe also you are reporting. Isn't there some double counting? Where do you draw the line? And also the amounts that could be leveraged from the investments. That's the question. The comment I have is we in Malawi are also establishing a national climate change fund. And in the process, it's not operational yet, but in the process, we have had 1 or 2 challenges. The first one is where to draw the line between what could be called, the separation between environment and the climate change actions. So whether to call it an environment fund, because climate change is also an environment, or just create a climate change fund. That's one. And the second one is on the sources of revenue into the fund at the national level, considering that like in our case, we have a number of other funds already existing, like fuel revenue funds and others, forestry fund also. So ownership also, to say, okay, should we shrink the other funds and then have one? Because if it's a climate change fund or environment and climate change fund, it will be supporting forestry activities, also energy, technology, etc. So that's becoming a challenge as well. I'll stop there for now, and thanks for the presentation.
Okay, thanks. So for the government contribution, it's under discussion for the replenishment. So far, we haven't had government contributions, but it's an issue that's on the table for our replenishment coming up next year. As I said, because the situation has changed a lot in 5-6 years now in Cambodia, and the budget has grown. There's an additional $1 billion in the budget every year. So now that discussion is on the table, well, it wasn't at the beginning. On the issue of double counting, I don't think that's an issue in our case. I mean, there's a reporting mechanism at the national level, so for donors to report on their contributions, and in that system, UNDP reports where the contributions come from, so they're attributed to EU and Sweden as needed. At the global level, I think, as far as I know, again, the donors will report it themselves. So EU and Sweden will report their contributions to the trust fund, and UNDP will only report its own contribution, as far as I know. But at the national level, in the tracking that's done by the government, I'm 100% sure that there's no double counting. And the government has been trying also to track climate finance a bit better. That's a different discussion, but it's also a challenge. And then on the issue of environment versus climate change and environment, from the Cambodia case, there is an environment fund which is pure government at the moment. So in our case, it's different approaches for environment and climate change, but I know there are models out there. I think in Bhutan and a few other countries, there's models out there where it's environment and climate change. So, I mean, I don't have a strong opinion on this. So like in the case of Cambodia, for the government, really the focus is on integrating climate change in the national budget, in the normal standard procedures of the national budget, rather than creating a separate fund, with the exception of this technical assistance, research, innovation fund that I help manage. Yeah.
Thank you, Julian. Just to add to that on the names of the fund, I think you can also learn from some of the countries in the region who's been pioneering in setting up their national funds. So for example, Rwanda, they have a fund called National Climate and Environment Fund. In the Philippines, this is a great example. I don't know if anybody's here from the Philippines. They have set up a National People Survival Fund to support the adaptation projects at the local level. So, for example, we work very closely with local government units to help them build capacity in accessing the fund. So it's called People Survival Fund, and it's actually appropriated. So the national budget is dedicated to this fund annually through the Climate Change Commission. And then finally, Ethiopia also has a national facility called Climate Resilient Green Economy Facility. So it really depends on the objective of the fund that you're trying to set up. Any other comments, questions, or discussion points you want to raise?
Oh, sorry. We have used the Rwandan case in our situation. So they visited Malawi, we have interacted, we sent some delegation to Rwanda. So we're basing the Rwandan case.
Yes, the Funera Fund.
Funera, yes.
Yes. So two, please.
Good morning. I am from the Philippines, and yeah, my question is about the People Survival Fund. We heard that the People Survival Fund has been operational for some years now. However, it seems that the rate of the local governments accessing the fund is really very low, and we wonder what makes the access very. Is it really very difficult? Because that's what we hear from the communities. And so we are wondering what are the mechanisms in place to maybe to streamline the process and to accelerate the access of the local governments about this. But also that to ensure that in streamlining the processes that the quality of the project proposals that come in are not compromised.
Thank you. I thought I'd share a bit of experience from the Bangladesh National Climate Change Trust Fund. I used to work there for some years, and the government established a National Climate Change Trust Fund in Bangladesh, which was in response to it was their political decision to show that they are very committed to the climate change response and the climate change actions at the national level. It was capitalized to the tune of about $300 million from the national budget through an act of parliament, and it was set up with great fanfare and excitement. And then the rubber hit the road, and the issues around basic governance issues around project cycle management, project cycle design, selection of projects, they become very quickly political decisions that have to be made. And the capacity of sector ministries to absorb money and report, design projects, deliver them, report them within a timeline that most climate change, people who are looking at impacts and processes. This is very different from the way government operates normally. And so sometimes the challenge of managing the National Climate Change Trust Fund is really an important thing to consider when you're setting these things up. I think also, in terms of replenishment, do you set it up as something that gets an annual budget from the government? Do you set it up as a revolving fund with focused on projects that can pay back, or how do you do this? And some of these things are just things that countries are still trying to get their heads around in terms of the management processes. So just a reflection on some of those experiences.
Hello, good morning. My name is Tungarai. I come from Nepal. Listening to all of those examples from different countries, I was just wondering how the civil society participation in the governance structure of such fund is happening in different countries. Because when it comes to the participation of different stakeholders, including of the civil society and indigenous peoples in particular, it's very critical and very challenging. If we see the big financing architecture institutions such as Climate Investment Fund, FCPF, UNDRED, and others, we have civil society participation in the governance structures, at least as an observer. But when it comes to the country level, we see even weaker participation of indigenous peoples and civil societies that ultimately impacts country ownership and also the acceptability of the funds, and also the broader impact of the fund at the country level and at community level. So how it is happening, anybody from any country or maybe from Cambodia can share us so that we can also learn something from there. Thank you.
Does anybody from the countries want to have an immediate reaction to this comment and question? If not, Julian.
Okay, so on the involvement of civil society, I mean, in our case, for example, the priorities before we launch call for proposals, the priorities of the fund are discussed with, we have this climate change technical working group mechanism in the country where civil society is represented. So we have those discussions on the overall focus of the fund. In terms of accessing the funds, of course, there are some, I mean, we don't provide micro grants, so we are a bit in between, you know, medium-sized type of grants. So it's sometimes a bit difficult to access for the really grassroots organizations. But what we've encouraged partnerships in this case between, for example, grassroots, you know, really local civil society organization with international NGOs or national NGOs that have more capacity. And we've had really some successful partnerships there. Some of our most successful projects have involved quite heavily the local communities and grassroots organizations. So yeah, but in our case, we also have, there are some other players who provide dedicated support to really this like smaller sized grants and with dedicated support for the really grassroots organizations. And in our case, these types of partnerships usually have worked well because the grassroots organization provide the local engagement that you need for, let's say, an adaptation project to work, and then the national or international NGOs can help link them up with local authorities, help with, of course, the project design and quality assurance of the projects and aspects like this. So it has worked relatively well in our case. And of course, we have mechanisms to make sure that people can, you know, complain and have their voices heard, and we make sure that all the communities that we work in know where the money is coming from, where they can complain if they have any issues, you know, the traditional standards that are there. Yeah.
And I think our colleagues from UNDP and the Philippines have very much addressed the challenges from both demand and supply side of the setting up the fund and managing the fund. And I'm very familiar with the frustration that local government units have in the Philippines to access PSF, because in order to get the adaptation project funding, it's too much work, or the awareness is not there, or capacity is not there to develop funding projects. So there has been a number of donors coming in and technical assistance organizations coming in to support the local government units in sharing how to develop funding projects or concept notes. And also there's an attempt to support the secretariat of the PSF to make sure they have the investment criteria set, and that's populated amongst the local government units as well as academic institutions around the Philippines. So in doing this, I want to sort of move on to the next question. So what are the available support out there in establishing your national funds or subnational facilities, and how easy is it to access them? Is there anybody who wants to share their experience in receiving support in doing this or providing support?
Yes. Okay. Good morning, Edgar Cruz from Colombia, and okay, I want to refer that we based on the peace process in Colombia, we established a national fund for the peace, and this was and this fund has a number of sub-funds, one of them really dedicated to climate, environment, and sustainability. So in that case, the decision of the government is to push in the agenda the topic. And then the loan, it was a loan from Inter-American Development Bank that has really managed to have the basis and the first available funds for this facility. And of course, what we are doing now is in all these stages of, okay, as it was referred with some other colleagues, on how to make the structures, how to make the decision making, the governance. But in that case, yeah, is to highlight that, okay, behind the creation of a national dedicated fund that will also receive part of the carbon tax, there is the backing of multilateral institution that is also providing the day-to-day management support for the day-to-day running business of this fund.
Anyone else who wants to share their experience? No. So one of the mechanisms or support available in setting up the funds or getting the funds ready for accreditation, we've also had experiences in a number of countries like Vanuatu, Rwanda, where they access the GCF readiness funds to meet the fiduciary management standards and also to help the staff within the secretariat of these funds to have the capacity to screen projects, coordinate with relevant stakeholders, and also to manage the projects moving forward. And for example, in Rwanda, the case with National Environment and Climate Fund is accredited to GCF, so there's even more complementarity in blending the national budget as well as multilateral funds within this facility. Julian, do you want to say a few words?
So in our case, we have a bit of a similar case going on for the decentralization funds that I mentioned earlier, so where they've accessed GCF readiness to help with some of the fiduciary, meeting some of the fiduciary standards. We've also provided some support. I mean, from my experience in Cambodia, my feeling is there's lots of partners ready to support. There's no shortage of offers. I think the Cambodian government gets at least 2 or 3 offers of support a year on this type of mechanisms from UN agencies, from multilateral development banks, the bilaterals. Some of them have dedicated facilities. We've heard about the French funds yesterday. So I think there are a lot, at least in the case of Cambodia, there's no shortage of options to get support. What may be an issue sometimes is the timing. So some of these institutions take a very long time to approve support packages. In the case of GCF, I think it varies. I've heard of some very short timelines, and sometimes you have to wait for a year or 18 months before you see the funds. So that can be an issue, and this is where from the CCCA side, this is where we've filled some of the gaps because we're able to allocate funds relatively quickly to address specific issues.
Thank you. I think that is a unique case, or do you agree that there's sufficient support out there for you to develop your national, subnational facilities or funds? Because I understand that Cambodia is a very unique case where they have many donors coming to the government for support. Is that the case in other countries, or is there any challenges, especially in the African countries? For Burkina Faso and Malawi, you mentioned the work. How are you being supported? Are there any challenges to the work?
Thank you very much. Actually, some donors decided to focus the interventions based on sectors, based on extra criteria, political criteria, such as maybe gender or democracy and so on and so forth. So this is something challenging. Secondly, let's raise the issue of governance as well. The challenge in many West African countries is when we set up a sort of institutions to deal with funds, in principle, the staff should be recruited. At the national level, at the political level, it could happen that the general director is designed by the minister of where the funds should be setting up. So we have those challenges in some African countries. So now, in terms of mobilizing the funds, the issue of sustainability and predictability is really a challenge as well. So even if we have the national budget coming as a contributor, until when these funds could be sustained through the contribution of donors. So this is also another challenge we're experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. So reflecting on that, I think one of so you talked about the donor criteria and donor managing that, mainstreaming that into your fund management. I think one of the key issues that are from the demand side, from the donor side, yes, they would need to see certain gender mainstreamed, certain ESS criteria being set for them to replenish the fund. But oftentimes I hear from donors that we don't see a robust pipeline of projects behind the fund. So is there a case, do you have any experience in sort of trying to bridge the gap between the projects and the expectations of the donors who's putting funds or national budget put to the fund? Because in case of Guyana, they have the National Fund for RED+, and one of the key concerns is they don't have a robust pipeline that's ready for the fund, and therefore the donors who's putting the fund into the national facility is questioning, can we replenish? So this sometimes is an issue rising in some of these countries where the national fund has been operating for a few years. So I would like to get some views from the floor and then maybe conclude with Julian's remarks on that. Two comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, as far as GEF projects, GCF projects, and through the bilateral cooperation, the different funds are concerned, there are a lot of shortcomings, a lot of limitations when it comes to the formulation of projects. If a fund is established, we know that each donor sometimes has the sample, or how I call it, the guidelines for project preparation. Always, the guidelines are not the same. So now there is a need to build the capacity in country at the national level, at the regional level, at the provincial level, to build the capacity of people to formulate concrete adaptation or mitigation projects. This is lacking. So it means that if some donors are really keen to put in place, to assist a country to put in place a fund, they have to provide also facilities for the formulation of projects. So actually, as far as GCF is concerned, it's the main issue. We can have an accredited national entity in place without any, how I call it, any expertise in country to be able to formulate. So the entity is there without, the expertise. So maybe it will depend on the accredited entity to develop or to prepare or to train a critical mass of experts to be able to formulate. This is another challenge, another issue we can discuss. But we think that in Africa in general, having experts ready, well-equipped, well-trained to be able to formulate concrete GCF projects, we have a lot to do. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Ahmed Abdallah Sound from the Comoros Islands, and I think the gentleman before me, he touched on what I wanted to say. The issue is capacity building in our countries, and especially in countries like Comoros, very small island in Africa. And some of the donors, they expect to find a national level already capacity that there to write proposal or to have a very strong project. But the main difficulties that we have can sometimes be not only in expertise in terms of climate change or environment or whatever, but it can also be language barriers. For example, for us, we are only maybe, how can I say this, like expert, but we can express ourselves only in French, for example. So we are confined to only the French word or French-speaking countries' donors or whatever. So we are losing opportunities just because of language barrier, for example. But the other comments I just wanted to say was about like capacity building and to have already people that are there that can write like project proposal, that being strong. So the fact like saying that donors are not coming because we don't have like strong proposals, that's very hard for us to take it as an argument for not being able to establish those funds. Yeah.
Any?
Thanks very much. No, just to I wanted to comment from the kind of contributor perspective, and I fully agree with all of these comments. I think this is a really key issue on capacity building. One project I wanted to highlight that the UK is taking forward, we launched it last year, is something called the Climate Finance Accelerator. And the idea here was to work with a few partner countries and bring in some financial expertise from the City of London. I mean, this is just the issue of language and translation is something here as well, because you have, you know, languages, global languages, but then you also have the language of finance and the language of the Environment Ministry, who probably has developed a national, an NDC or a national adaptation plan, you know, in every country developed and developing. So with this project, we were kind of trying to work with the partner countries to take their NDCs and work with finance experts and investors and the private sector, and to identify the elements and turn them into kind of investment plans and identify how we'll help transform them into kind of project pipelines. But I think, I mean, this is one project and it's very early stages, working with only 4 partners, Colombia and Mexico, and I think it's a real challenge to us to bring that into adaptation as well as mitigation, and also to work with some of the smaller countries where the capacity building need may be even bigger. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to highlight the issue about language as well, and about, you know, the format even of how you develop your project document. A project will be rejected because you didn't use the word catalyze, you know, because that's what the donor was looking for, and even though you might have been doing catalytic action, you didn't call it that, so it just doesn't get through. I think there's also another thing about being very pragmatic about what's happening at country level. Building capacity is very long term and needs consistent, persistent investment. And if you've got donors who have 1-year project, 2-year project, this is going to take some time. And then to add to that complexity is that once you have some capacity at government level, they get snapped up by the UN. So, you know, or they get snapped up by the next big thing, or they end up working at the GCF. So these are the kind of dynamics that you have to deal with at a country level. And capacity building really, you know, in terms of the climate change response that's required at country level, we need to start thinking of capacity building right down from primary school level. So it's a much bigger investment than we are actually saying. Readiness proposals, which take 18 months for you to then end up with good analytical studies on climate vulnerability, is not enough. Anyway.
Okay, thank you. Vicky from Belgium, and just wanted to give some subnational donor perspective on this as well, and I thank you for all the information shared already. I think for us, I mean, I work for the government of Flanders in Belgium, and I mean, you could say that we work through 3 different streams. First, we also have a Flemish climate change fund, which is both for internal and international climate finance. And there you do have a bit of competition about what goes to internal regulation and what goes to international. But because that's from the Department of Environment, we don't have the people in place to go for specific climate change projects. So we have delivered our contributions to the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund through that. So because we just don't have the capacity ourselves to go through individual projects and with countries. The second part is a Flemish Partnership Water for Development. It's more for the SDG for water, but we are using this channel because there we do have relations with countries themselves to work with them. That we also use it for climate projects, but we do make a distinction: what is a water project, what is climate specific, and what is climate relevant. So the lucky thing is we don't have that much money, we don't have that many projects where we can actually make a good assessment on that one. And the way we work then with the countries is actually through well, Flemish partners in those countries. So the money goes through a Flemish NGO or whatever, but one of the criteria is that they will have to work at least with one local partner. And of course, it has to be water-related and climate change specific or relevant. And just very briefly, also a third channel is more of development cooperation. So they have more people in place on the ground, and then they specifically work with the partner countries, which is for us mainly South Africa and Malawi. And there you can see that they have more dialogue with the governments, with the people on to have that dialogue. But then again, it's because they have the capacity to do so, while the Department of Environment, well, it's just basically 2 or 3 people, and then you don't, I mean, so for subnational governments, it's also quite difficult to go into very detailed dialogues with the partner countries, and so we try to find different ways to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm asked to wrap up, so let's take one final comment from Nepal, and we'll wrap up this session.
Can you hear me? Yeah. In regard to the question, is there enough finance for climate change action? In context of Nepal, we have very different situation. Maybe the climate change action priorities should be also diverse. There are a lot of efforts and interest in mitigation and adaptation, but very little attention to the kind of forests we have in Nepal, in the mountains, and to the climate crisis around the Himalayan region in Nepal. We have a lot of issues of loss and damage. We have a lot of issues of landslides, glacier lake outburst, and these kind of, mountain-related issues, and also the forest that grows very slow in the mountains but carries very high value for biodiversity and other values. But the donors or the donor countries might have bit limited priorities on this one and knowledge about this one. That should be diversified and be aware of that one also. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's have Julian give us a few closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up this session. Julian?
Well, I just wanted to add 2 points in relation to the questions. One is on the pipeline. So in our case, of course, the size of the project is a bit smaller, so it's slightly less of a challenge. But I mentioned the issue of having a purely competitive process versus earmarking some funds for specific sectors or even sometimes institutions. And I think, of course, if you have a purely competitive process, then the best proposal writer wins. And that's not always the top priority of the country. So that's a risk. So I think having some degree of earmarking to try to really target specific priority areas, and then that also allows you, I mean, at least in our case, to give support, hands-on support to proposal developers, because we know there's a good idea out there and we need to help them reach the standards. So there's a risk with a purely competitive model. And on the issue of I mentioned earlier the availability of support. I think, yes, very often it comes not necessarily from the country strategies of the donors or their country programs, but many donors, Dominic mentioned for the UK, Germany also has one. There's global programs for climate finance readiness types. But it's true that there's an issue with sometimes it's only short-term support. So, you know, they'll fly in someone to help you. It's relatively short-term, but as Joanne mentioned, those capacity challenges require engagement over a long period of time. So sometimes it's good to have a kind of a capacity development facility set up at the country level that can provide this engagement over time. So these were just my final two points.
Thank you very much. So we'll conclude this session, and I hope to see you at the plenary. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Philip Weish from the Bahamas, and I'm going to be moderating this session. We have about 10 minutes, I think, before the other group come from downstairs up. So, and we have coffee afterwards. So just put it in perspective. So we're going to wait for the other group to come up, and then we're going to resume. And I would ask the moderators, Margaret, Doobie, and I guess you can get mic'd up or you can get hand up, whatever you want to do in terms of being able to interact. So we have 10 minutes, so please just relax, and we'll resume in a few moments. Okay, I see Margaret is here, Celia is here. I don't see, where's Judy?
I think they're just wrapping up.
They're just wrapping up, okay. All right. Wow, that took longer, why?
The problem is they start talking and then they prepare the report back, and then while they come here and then they see coffee outside, so they
Okay, all right, all right.
they should be there now.
Yeah, no. Give them the time. They have the time to do what they need to do. It's fine. The discussions were interesting.
Which one were you in?
I went to all of them. I sat in at least for a couple of minutes and these are all of them. But this one here was also quite interesting. morning again, everybody. We are running about 15 minutes late. So the suggestion is being made at the moment is that you may want to go outside and get your coffee and come in. And then what we'll do is we'll take 15 minutes into the coffee break period in order to go through the discussion, okay? So please, get your coffee and come back. We're waiting for the final group to come from downstairs, and so that's the only outstanding issue we have right now. And as soon as they get here, we'll ring the bell Okay, everybody. I think we should start getting ready. Can I please ask my three presenters to come to the podium? Let me admit to all of you that I have a problem. The disease is called ahead of time-itis or on-time-itis. I actually like to start things actually on time, but that's not going to be possible this morning because of the fact that one of our groups ran a little late. As Mohammed had indicated early this morning, we are building from the ground up in this series of discussions this morning. On essentially what we've had is we've had 3 breakout groups that has taken place already. Margaret, who is immediately to my left, is from the Global Green Growth Institute. She was responsible for the group that looked at mobilizing, that spoke to the issue of the experiences of establishing funds. Duty, if I'm right? Duty?
Yes.
Yeah. Duty was responsible for looking at the budgetary planning and devising climate investment plans. And Duty is from Indonesia.
Yeah.
Salia, from the Adaptation Fund, was also responsible for another group, a breakout group, that looked at the whole issue of how to build effective and capacity building effective mechanisms in the whole discussion. Again, let me thank the Standing Committee of Finance, the Government of Korea, and the donors for being here today. I actually have enjoyed myself. I usually get quite bored when I come to financing discussions, but in the context of the discussions we've had both yesterday and today, I found that we have been covering some issues in ways that has made it very much easier for me to understand some of the issues that we are faced with. I would like to now turn the floor over to the discussion leaders and thank also the participants for being engaged in the discussions. I was able to walk into all of the rooms, and I noted that virtually everyone was engaged quite actively in what was going on, and I thank you for that. But to the discussion leaders, I'm going to start with Margaret. You have given me one sentence that summarizes what happened today.
Yes.
One sentence to summarize what happened in your breakout groups, and the secretary will put that sentence up.
Yes.
One sentence.
So one sentence is sustainable and consistent capacity building is needed for countries to address challenges of both demand and supply side of the national financing mechanisms.
Okay. Now, of course, the next follow-up is that you need to just expound on that.
Yes.
And you have 5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes, all right. So the group had a very good discussion on challenges and lessons learned, and quite surprisingly, we had quite a few examples from countries like Burkina Faso, Malawi, the Philippines, on setting up their national climate funds or facilities. And we also heard from our expert, Julian, on the Cambodia's Climate Change Alliance experience. So one of the major lessons learned and challenges were country ownership. How do we actually derive country ownership of these funds, and how do we mainstream that into national budgeting? Something that my colleague Duty could expand on from his discussion. The fund secretariat needs to have strong, robust climate cycle project cycle management, have good selection criteria for the projects, and also how do you put together good strategies for replenishment of the fund? Is it going to be a revolving fund, or is it going to be mainstreamed into national budgeting? And also there was a very important comment on inclusion of CSOs and indigenous people in the governance of these funds, and also project review of the funding proposals. One of the main discussion point was around capacity. How do we build and develop sustainable longer-term capacity within the government? So what are the supports out there? Some of the examples were GCF readiness, although there was some frustration with how long it takes to get readiness funding approved for the country. So there needs to be a fast-track process to help countries access that. Also, UK and Belgium government also share their experience in some of providing some of the technical support for example, climate finance accelerator, and subnational support from the Belgium government. But also, finally, there was a sentiment that, yes, these supports are great, but we need to think about a longer-term sustainable capacity building for the people who will be carrying out these works. So somebody said maybe we should start this from elementary school, but that it's to that extent that short-term, just few months or 1 or 2 years capacity building will not be sufficient to build adequate capacity in the countries to manage and operationalize national funds effectively.
No, thank you very much for that. I'm going to go to Celia next. Celia, you were dealing with Antigua and Barbuda as a case study, and you also have a one sentence. What is your one sentence?
Our one sentence ended up being something quite similar to this sentence that you're all seeing. Again, continuity, sustainability are essential for success and creating an enabling environment for transformation through. And we identified several points: enhanced accessibility of finance, simplified policy landscape, retaining knowledge, building and retaining capacity, and learning by doing through concrete interventions. So basically what we had discussed was focused around the main challenge, which is how to get climate finance flowing down to national, subnational, and local levels. So all the way down to the local level, through this financial architecture that turns out is quite complicated even in a small country context with different agencies and organizations all having a stake and the roles and responsibilities not being clearly mapped out necessarily at this point. We all know that climate finance and climate change and everything surrounding climate is still quite dynamic, and there are many opportunities, but there are also many challenges and barriers as a result. Antigua and Barbuda's case spoke to that with the establishment of the Sustainable Island Resource Framework Fund, which is a way to simplify this policy landscape, and also to harmonize some of the resource flows as an example of one way with dealing with this, again, highly dynamic landscape, both internally and externally. We talked about readiness support, the importance of readiness support, particularly in a very flexible way. We talked about the importance of national planning and taking those processes on board, and also embedding plans into whatever framework, such as, for example, the fund, so that the plans are followed. We talked about the importance of learning and south-to-south cooperation, so that other countries can learn lessons that arise and come out of the process. We talked a bit about direct access and how concessional finance can be a big business. Accreditation can be challenging, but my sense is that was considered useful as a means of building capacity, which ultimately is, as the previous discussant mentioned, essential for sustainability, for long-term prospects of developing the kind of an environment that would enable transformation to actually occur. And so with that, basically, we've converged on a number of points, the importance of going towards a relatively simple, relatively streamlined, relatively agile process, but not at the expense of capacity. Learning by doing, for example, is one way to build capacity and have a concrete output at the end. And hopefully with time, the this kind of process will be self-perpetuating and self-sustaining. So I guess I will leave it at that for now.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Duty, you also had a similar experience working with your group, but your group was focused more in terms of incorporating into budgetary processes. Now, what is your one sentence, the first question, and then can you please summarize your discussion?
Okay. So one sentence from a group is budgetary tagging informs the government what policy and climate finance needs. In terms of advantages, we discussed about the use of budgetary tagging to know, identify the gaps, and then from that we can make an adjustment to the budget and helps access to source of financing, identify financial needs, and also it's useful to review project proposal. By budget tagging, we know that which one should be supported by national budget. In terms of challenges, one of the main issues was about the capacity of both national and regional governments about how to differentiate between adaptation and mitigation. In Philippines case, it was very clear, and from my country's perspective, this issue is also something that emerges. How the line ministries, for example, regional government, know exactly the differences between adaptation and mitigation to correctly identify which one is climate-related activities and which one is not. From that, we need then commitment from different actors, which is quite difficult. Many stakeholders are involved, line ministries, how to make them really cooperate to agree on this kind of activities. Philippine example shows that leadership is important. It is translated into normative basis of regulation. Another thing is the importance of technical assistance capacity building to deal with the lack of understanding of for example, the difference between adaptation and mitigation in national and local level. So I'll stop with that for the moment.
No, thank you for that. Two of you are from international agencies, GCCI, an adaptation fund, or GEF, adaptation fund. Are you surprised that the word capacity has come out over and over and over, and even though you're dealing with different, are you surprised at that?
No.
No.
Okay, so no one's surprised, but that seems to be fundamentally what this, irrespective of whether you talk about the national so how do you address those challenges in light of the different discussions you've had?
So from where I come from, so GGGI is a longer-term embedded advisor to the government. So we were set up to promote a longer-term capacity building of the government to realize their green growth objectives in the country. So we have been set up for 5 years, so we've been embedded in our focal ministries, be it Ministry of Finance, Planning, or Environment, to help develop that capacity. So we do very much relate to some of these discussion points that, yes, we need to think about a longer-term capacity building. However, one of my lingering questions is when does that stop? And how do we ensure that capacity is completely transferred to the government or the stakeholders at the national, subnational level? So it is a continuous challenge, and we have been, so in the context of climate funds that we help government to establish and operate, that's another area where we sit with the government to make sure we develop the investment criteria with them and have staff be able to review the projects that are coming in. And also, our group had a discussion about language barriers. So some of the African countries, French has to be the main language. So even that support to translate some of these these global funds criterias, global funds procedures into their language is also a challenge. So that's another area we provide support to on a daily basis. So it is a continuous challenge, and if I can answer your question in a crisp way, then I don't think we would be all sitting here.
Yeah, it's really difficult to answer that question in a crisp way. Capacity at all levels, in all forms, depending on the target audience, there's just so many aspects to it. But I will mention two things that directly relate to Adaptation Fund. We have a readiness program which aims to build capacities of national implementing entities and those entities that aspire, or organizations or agencies that aspire to become national implementing entities. And so through this program, we provide different kinds of support so that they can meet the standards to become accredited with us and receive funding directly through the direct access modality. And in the course of that process, the feedback that we have received and what we have seen is that, yes, it does help the organization build its capacity, regardless of whether it ends up being accredited or not accredited, or if it becomes accredited, whether it ends up accessing our funding or not. It does help build capacity that ends up useful in some way. The other purpose of our readiness program is to increase the volume of, or a number of high quality proposals that come our way. Obviously, if the quality of proposals submitted to Adaptation Fund increases, likely the quality of proposals that come to other funders will probably increase as well once that capacity is in place. And last, and by no means the least, Adaptation Fund is mandated to finance concrete adaptation projects. That means there has to be a concrete output. Capacity building is not necessarily considered a concrete output in my understanding, but there is no project, Adaptation Fund or otherwise, at this time that doesn't have a capacity building component. Capacity building is foundational. And so we see capacity building at all levels, at project levels, outside of projects, getting ready to start projects, getting ready to start thinking about projects. Yes, capacity building is key.
Are you surprised, Dodi, that this was also an issue in the budgetary issues?
Yeah. For me, in the government, it's not something that is surprising. Budgetary tagging is a new knowledge, new activity, and when you are in the government, you don't know whether you are in the same position tomorrow. So there should be a continuous capacity building for government officials, because the nature of the government is the staff is changing, and I won't be here forever because tomorrow will be someone replacing me. Who knows? So that's the reality that we have. In terms of budget tagging, for example, every year we have to deal with different officials in the line ministry, and that new person needs to keep up with the knowledge about budget tagging. So that's the nature of the government, and that therefore the capacity building, continuous support is mandatory.
Margaret, you want to make another point. Go ahead.
So I was inspired by our colleague from Adaptation Fund. I wanted to stress the point of importance on peer-to-peer learning. That's what we've been seeing working in 25 different countries with focal ministries, that it's often very powerful for a government to learn from a different government on their experience in setting up funds or putting forward climate change projects, both mitigation and adaptation. So for example, in our group, a representative from Malawi was saying in developing their national fund, they're actually benchmarking and learning from the case of Rwanda. When we presented the Philippines People Survival Fund that finances adaptation projects at local level, a lot of the Pacific Island countries were interested in learning about the process and the challenges that came from it. So I wanted to stress the point on the importance of peer-to-peer learning, the bilateral and trilateral arrangements. And also, I can't agree more on the hands-on learning by doing approach, because we saw from our partner governments like Ethiopia, Rwanda, where the accredited entity is the line ministry, to GCF, and it took them a while, and it was a very, very burdensome process, but they got their first direct access projects approved by the GCF board, which means that they're starting to build in-house capacity on how to approach this, what consultations need to be held, and how do you articulate climate impact in a project proposal. So I think I second the importance of learning by doing approach as well.
The other word that I heard from the sentences is the issue of sustainability. And the other thing I heard in the discussion, because I walked into all of them, was the issue of not language, but languages. Someone made a comment, I think, that it's not just the fact that you're talking about translation from one language to another, but it's also in budgetary terms, is languages related to how did you incorporate things in that system. Does anyone give any examples of how that has been done successfully?
In Indonesian's case, if I can give that as an example, we made a criteria or guideline for ministries, officials. And secondly, we incorporate that into system. What I mean by system is we do it systematically in the application of budgeting, computerized. So therefore, the problem of that language, to some extent, can be solved. So everybody has a similar guideline from the authority. In this case, is the Ministry of Environment.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I heard, of course, is that you're not dealing with one ministry. You're dealing with several different ministries. So again, are there any examples of how that cross-ministry involvement is facilitated well and it works as a good example?
If I may, I think the topic that our discussion group was having on national financing vehicles or national financing funds does play a critical role in promoting that coordination amongst the different line ministries and also different stakeholders at various levels of national, subnational, and local, including the CSOs and private sector actors. So in order for the national fund to be mainstreamed into national budget systems and national planning processes, of course, all needs to be consulted. So this also plays if played well, as a very good coordination mechanism for countries.
I want to say that based on my experience, countries organize internally in ways that are quite different. Some have steering committees, some have prime minister's office oversight over climate flows, climate finance flows. There are different ways to skin a cat, as the saying goes. Having said that, it's an opportunity. Well, with that in mind, countries have a real opportunity to either streamline their processes or develop a process that works for them, because in this environment with a lot of uncertainty and complexity that comes from external external circumstances, one thing that a country can control is probably how say climate finance is channeled internally. Again, to be fair, with external uncertainty, it's difficult to maybe set it up in a way that will be ideal. So I guess the conclusion is we all have to work together externally, internally to do the best we can.
The other thing I heard, and this is in Margaret's group, was the whole issue of donor expectations. There is an expectation for a certain model or a certain way to be a certain way forward. And that expectation can lead to challenges and bottlenecks. Is that a fair statement to make, that the donor expectations affect all the different levels of involvement?
So that's a challenging question. We can reopen the discussion here. So there was a remark about, well, I've made a remark that some donors are, in discussing the replenishment strategy of these national funds, some donors do request heavy criteria, especially around ESS gender, of course, due to their funding requirements. However, the countries do face challenges because basically they don't have the capacity. Well, our group has mentioned that they're lacking capacity to cope, align with those compliance to those donor expectations and criteria. So there was a bit of a discussion, chicken or egg situation. Do we need to invest more in capacity building of the governments to ensure that they're aligning well with the donor expectations and criteria? So it's a chicken and egg situation, and I would love to hear from the floor how the countries also see it.
I got the impression that it's dynamic, but it is doable.
It's dynamic, but certainly doable, yes.
Okay. I see Ditas is pointing. I'm going to get to you, Ditas. The timing we've agreed is that we will be going to Q2, so just to let everyone know, so we can open the floor up to questions from the floor. But there's anything else that was not said that you want to speak to before we open up to the floor? Good, we covered everything, so we can open up to the floor. Does anybody want to? Ditas, are you ready?
He's not allowed.
Please, can we have the mic up front? We've got Ayman.
Thank you. Hussein Abaza from Egypt. I just would like to pick up on the capacity development issue, which is really very critical. In most of the instances where we come from, developing countries, we rely on outside expertise to deliver on capacity building. And it hasn't been, let me be frank on this and upfront, it hasn't been that effective. And I think there is a need to build internal capacities to deliver on the real capacity building needs of countries. And that means that we need institutional capacity. We have the expertise at the national level, but I think they need to be more empowered. We need to do real assessment of the needs for training at the different levels, whether they be at the government level, NGOs, private sector, and it needs to be more long-term, and as I said, reflecting on the priorities and needs of the country. So that's because the way, at least the experience I've had with UNEP was that we have been receiving a lot of funding and a lot of training courses coming from outside, but it hasn't been that effective as far as developing countries are concerned. And I think we need to emphasize that internal capacities needs to be built to deliver on these national capacities. Thank you.
Ayman, could we give the mic to Ayman, please?
Yes, thank you very much. only CF members are allowed, not the co-chairs. Thank you very much. Thanks for the, the panelists here, and thanks for the information. I guess let's first set the terminology is right. All of you said donors and donors and donors. In this business, there are no donors. Okay? If you start saying donors, the whole dynamics will change. Because this is the exact struggle we have. As you try to make this country-driven and establish country ownership, that doesn't jive along with the notion of donation, because donors would want to dictate on you how things should be done. So if you keep saying donors, you'll never be able to establish country ownership. And this is the struggle now we have with the Adaptation Fund. Adaptation Fund is the one that the most successful fund that we have in terms of establishing country ownership. And guess what? Very soon it will die. It's going to go away as part of the dynamics of the United Nations Convention negotiations and the Paris Agreement. Simply because of the sources of finance. Simply because of the will of whom you think are donors. So you really need to change the entire mindset to say, listen, national capacities, direct access, all of that can only succeed if we say this is something has to be done based on needs, based on national drivenness to the whole process. The struggle you have seen at the GCF board meeting just 2 days ago, that's exactly to the heart of the situation. That as we're trying to maintain national drivenness to it, as we're trying to maintain the way it was designed, the way it was structured, the current replenishment process is driving it to the other direction, is imposing new kind of modality that would take the country drivenness out of it, that would take the national drivenness out of it, that would be a mechanism where you do it this way or nothing. So I think we need to change that mindset. I think it behooves us that we just, for those of us who are in the convention, who are coming from the negotiation of climate change, they understand this. Those who come from finance ministries, they don't understand this. Those who come from any other ministry, they don't understand this. And this is part of the struggle that we have. At the GCF, we have new board members who have nothing to do with climate change negotiations, and they are coming as ministries of finance, rightfully so, trying to do things the way they do it in finance ministries. If I had my finance ministry involved in this board, they would perhaps be doing the same thing. But that's the whole thing. This climate change finance is there for a purpose, is there for fulfilling the commitment under the convention, and it's there to help developing countries go about their life the way they're supposed to be going in terms of adapting to climate change and contribute, not a commitment, contribute to mitigation of climate change. So this is all psychological, and this is all kind of dynamics. If you don't keep in your mind, talk as much as you want about establishing systems. And this is a good example. Adaptation Fund has been there for 10 years. Now it's being scrapped. Now it's being dismantled. Why? Because what you think are donors are dictating how source of finance should come to the Adaptation Fund. And that will change the whole dynamics. Let me just leave it there, because it's all politics. It's all the will of developed countries fulfilling their financial
I'd like to thank Ayman and Egypt for that. Does anybody want to react to what was said? Because I was going to suggest we do it slightly differently. Because what I heard from the discussion was that we are actually talking about partnerships as opposed to donors. The context of donors came in one question that was asked in this particular room. But the common theme that I've heard so far has been capacity building, it has been sustainability, and about the fact that you need to stay engaged over long periods of time.
Well, I would also actually add country-drivenness to it. It's very important for us. This is a key criterion of the Adaptation Fund, and I think it's important really to emphasize that.
Yeah.
I would agree.
So we would agree, therefore, that we are talking in this particular context about partnerships, and I think Ivan would like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But not donors are recipients of donations, and there is no those who give the money, those who are bigger receive the money.
Point taken. Does anybody else have a question for the panel? Sorry, I'm saying Ignacio? Yes, from Chile? Yes? Not Chile.
Sorry, I'm not from Chile. I'm from Nepal. I'm Raju from Nepal. Well, I wanted to get back to the earlier question raised on capacity building, because this is something very key. What we have seen is there are lots of international entities who would like to come and really support our governments. But in fact, what we see ending up is the international entities themselves strengthening their capacity or building their own capacity instead of the government. So I was just wondering, well, I mean, it's important. Like for a country like ours, we will continue to need these entities for maybe many more years. But is there a way how you can flip this so that you end up building the capacity of the countries in real sense, and while of course the entities also have their strength built on? Because you see that the entities coming with lots of technical assistance or capacity building aspect to strengthen and support the government. But even writing a letter sometimes is like, okay, instead of they writing the letter, we write it and they just sign it. So how do we flip that argument to say that we strengthen the capacity of the national institutions of the government rather than the entities themselves?
Thank you. Can we get the microphone to Amjad, please? Up front. And let's hear Amjad's question before we react.
Thank you. It's quite similar question as just Raju said. I think my colleague from Adaptation Fund said, yes, the Adaptation Fund is funding for concrete adaptation, but it is inevitable that they can't avoid capacity building. Then I think the question goes again, what is climate financing? Is capacity building not part of climate financing? I'm getting a bit confused. I think I see the Adaptation Fund is really funding for concrete adaptation, but I'm getting kind of questionable as to whether the Adaptation Fund is also not supposed to be helping to build the capacity. What Raju said, it's true, because if you have seen over the 10 years, I'm just taking an example from the Adaptation Fund. By the way, I mean, it has been a fund that has served really, really to help the countries. But I think it has built the capacities of the entities, but rather countries who have received struggle. Let's be very frank. Initially, yes, the entities who were accredited were supposed to help to accredit the national entities. But look, has any of them came up? I kept saying that there was no intention whatsoever to take over from the multilaterals, from the direct access. When we had the direct access modality, there was no intention whatsoever to take over from the multilaterals. So, yes. Thank you.
We have another question. Then I'm going to ask the panel to react to anything they've heard.
Yeah, Fred from Uganda. The issue of capacity building, I would put it in quotes. The issue of sustainability, I would put it in quotes. Why? Because we've got issues, I think Raju put it right, and it was also supported by Amjan. When we look at the capacity building, who are responsible for this? Sometimes it's multilateral, sometimes it's the various implementing agencies in our entities. And the question is, when you're stepping on a stem of a tree, can you cut that stem? The problem is that capacity building is the livelihood of these multilaterals, institutions that are there, and if they impart that knowledge to enable the governments to do it on their own, they'll have lost the job. So I think there's a big problem, and the sustainability cannot work. Capacity building will remain at awareness level. It will remain at providing guidelines, but imparting applicable knowledge may not be possible with capacity building. Thank you.
Okay. Can I ask the panel to react, and can you give the microphone to Sweden? Okay, but let's get the panel to react first, and then you'll have the next question.
So, on the capacity building aspect, this is one thing GGGI really promotes is the TOT model, training of the trainers, because there is a challenge that as much as we want to help the government build the capacity, the government, as Duty said, changes as well. So there's a risk of, we put in effort into working with focal officers who's actually writing the concept notes for climate change adaptation projects, for example, and they change after 2 years, or in some places after 1 year. So where does that capacity go? So we believe in the TOT model and make sure that we reach out to the different levels of the government so that we can slowly embed these capacities within the government itself. And second is focus on younger generation capacity building. And I was joking that somebody said we should start this from elementary school, but it is really the younger generation who's going to come in later to lead the climate change actions and projects. So we do have a capacity building program in the Philippines where we sign MOU with different academic institutions at university level to help them build their capacity and also build awareness of why climate change is important for their own country.
Yes.
Yeah, on the capacity building, adaptation fund is not, its mandate is not capacity building. Its mandate is concrete adaptation action. Reducing vulnerability, increasing resilience. But in order to get to a point where you achieve that outcome, concrete adaptation action, there are many, many steps, as you all well know. Given the capacity constraints in the context where we work, which is the most vulnerable communities, which is where we aspire to work, capacity constraints can be limiting to the point of impossible to get the project going. Just in our discussion group, somebody said that in a specific small island, least developed country, the capacity to access a readiness grant isn't there. So if you don't have the capacity to access readiness grant, how are you going to have the capacity to access funding for a project? So the capacity needs are great, and if you're going to get to a point where you're able to implement or execute a successful adaptation project in a place that sorely needs it, there are a lot of steps in capacity building that need to be taken. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say the Adaptation Fund supports capacity building through its project work, through its programming, and through its readiness program. Capacity building is foundational, and we're just not there yet where we can assume that the capacity is there and jump straight to the brick and mortar or whatever.
I just want to comment on the partnership with donor. To some extent, there is a donor-driven. In budgetary planning, for example, it is a partnership with donor. But then the question is, after we've come to the result and we know the needs, and then we should be able to drive the donor which areas need support. The question is whether that needs will be met by donors. Maybe yes, maybe no. We haven't come to that stage, but what we plan to do is after we have the result and then we are clear enough of what should be done, and then we will come, if needed, to donor. This is the area that we need support to achieve our NDC, for example. So whether that's possible, that remains a question.
Okay. Question from the floor?
Sorry, it's a question and a comment. I wanted to get to the issue of basically institutional learning in the international climate finance architecture from the recognition of the need for readiness and capacity building. And as the colleague from the Adaptation Fund has mentioned, it's not the explicit mandate of the Adaptation Fund to provide readiness support or capacity building. But I think then in building the Green Climate Fund and applying lessons learned, that was actually recognized as a significant shortcoming, which is why within the Green Climate Fund context, there is so much focus, including money provided for readiness finance. So I think there is the one issue of the institutional setting for climate funding, recognizing that readiness has to be an integral part and support has to be an integral part for capacity building. And I would agree with those that have said it's not enough to bring in some international consultant. It's absolutely crucial to build the capacity in-house. And again, that also applies to, I know what some countries fear as additional environmental and social or gender requirement. But as a journey that builds the capacity in-house and the understanding in-house, it's not to be feared. It's something to embrace. If it's something that is seen or understood as a ticking exercise to fulfill some perceived requirements, then it's obviously a problem. I also wanted to quickly go onto the notion of the responsibility of multilateral implementing entities. In the Green Climate Fund, we had a decision of the board meeting in Barbados that made it very clear that there was an expectation that multilateral entities, as a requirement of their fast-track accreditation, should do everything possible to support the capacity building, leading to the accreditation of national implementing entities. Now, the fact of the matter is the Secretariat has not done a good job in actually tracking and holding to account multilateral entities on providing that service and doing that job, and multilateral entities haven't been good at actually accounting for what they are doing in that. And so I think this is something that needs to fundamentally shift. And lastly, one point in terms of provision of capacity and readiness support at the national level, we need to actually look at it, and civil society in the Green Climate Fund has mentioned it again and again, on a notion and an understanding of subsidiarity, which means that you are trying to rely on expertise on the most lowest local level possible, and that should be including a requirement for actually looking at consultants. There is a lot of expertise within countries that might not be the expertise that multilateral implementing entities have on their roster. It might not be the expertise that PricewaterhouseCoopers has on their roster. But that then just means that we have to look a little bit more widely and make sure that opportunities for those local experts exist. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. Is there any other, well, we have some virtual participants. Did we get any comments from the virtual participants? Mr. Secretary, can they comment on that? In addition to you, of course, there are individuals who are watching online, so this is why we're so well dressed today. Hopefully we will get some reaction from them to some of these questions. The answer is apparently they are not up yet. But again, I heard everyone agreeing. Oh, please. Joycelyn, you want to take the mic first, please? Either of you ladies can decide who wants to speak first. Do we have another mic? Is there anybody can pass down another microphone for the next person so we can continue?
Yeah. Just to clarify what was mentioned by our colleagues here from GDI, that the capacity building in the Philippines, well, we do have support from different international partners, but the thing is we have to emphasize that it's being done by local experts. So we are doing this, capacitating our higher education because we wanted to establish center of excellence so that it will not remain in a few number of local experts, but this should be sustained and more, and the state universities and colleges could also be the link of the national government in capacitating the local governments. So it's really institutionalizing as well, so that will not be very dependent on small group of consultants, local consultants, but definitely not international consultants doing the capacity building.
Yes. Pass the mic, please. Go ahead.
I had a question for the Adaptation Fund, given that it was identified that its way of looking at country-drivenness was considered a strength. I'd just be curious to hear kind of the way in which you looked at that criteria and assessed it, and what characteristics could typically indicate strength in that area, if there are any examples you could share.
Sure. We have lots of examples. Actually, every one of our projects is an example of country-drivenness. None of our projects can be submitted to us. None of the projects can be submitted to us without explicit endorsement from the country itself. It has to be official, formal. We are quite rigorous on that. Also, the proposals that are submitted to us that have sections that require the applicant to explain to us why this is in line, how is it in line, reference all the documentation that is relevant in terms of plans, strategies, NDCs, everything that is relevant to the project. This is an area that we look at quite closely, as we do at the other criteria. But what I wanted to mention is, as you know, we have a modality direct access, which allows us to finance directly nationally accredited implementing entities. And those essentially being a national implementing entity, in a way, are quite sort of, relevant for the country-drivenness question, but also relevant to the question of, that was the discussion that just took place now, concerning say, consultants and identifying the appropriate consultants who are not necessarily on the roster of big multinationals. So these are just some of the many ways in which I think country-drivenness does emerge, both through our active efforts, but also through the way the system has been set up.
Can I ask the panelists to sum up? Margaret, you want to go, please?
Oh.
Nope.
I was going to react to something that Adaptation Fund has said. But yes, to sum up, I think the last point on country-driven approach is really key to making success in basically putting different stakeholders and players in the field together as partners to realize the goal. And in doing that, I think there needs to be a very strong political also will to commit to the work. So for examples, in some of the countries like Ethiopia, where their national development strategy is the climate resilient green economy strategy, it reinforces the people of Ethiopia to think that they're doing all of these climate change adaptation mitigation projects in order to become the middle income country by 2025, if I recall correctly. So how do we basically change the mindsets of that? And that does take a long-term sustainable capacity building within the country, including all the relevant stakeholders related to the matter. So I'll leave it.
And I heard you use the word intergenerational.
Yes.
Earlier point.
Related to everything? Or
everything.
Everything. Okay, I agree with the term country-driven, but it is something easier said than done, actually, in practice. The how to make that really in reality is difficult, or it's challenging. The way people understand it is also different. What does it mean, country-driven? So when I met many colleagues, they have many different answers. So no exactly one answer to that. So what is country-driven? I don't know. That's the question that I posed to you all. Yeah.
I really like the comment that you made, if I can just jump in. Like I said, I mean, come on, we're on a panel here. We have, 1 minute to wrap up? There's country-drivenness is a complicated thing, just like a country is a complicated entity. And how to ensure country-drivenness, we could all write a PhD thesis on that and still not be done with the topic. And while you were mentioning this, I was thinking of all the things that we require, like consultations for our projects and this and that, and we just, you know, we're just not going to scratch the surface even of this topic.
So
but I think we all agree that country-drivenness is key.
Yeah. Yeah. But then this is a Standing Committee on Finance activity we engage in. So what would you tell the Standing Committee on Finance is their job to do going forward? What would you tell those members that they need to do? Continue doing this or change the game plan?
Well, I can't say change the game plan. I think one of the key recommendations that came up from the group discussion was, yes, we see the huge need for support to capacity building within the country. There are many mechanisms out there, lots of readiness, different kinds of readiness opportunities. However, accessing it is way too complicated. And the country is trying to access readiness in order to build the capacity to actually do the projects. So if you make that complicated, then it's going to take a while to get there. So I plead that you can look at some simplification of these readiness opportunities for the countries and entities.
No, I'm going to thank the panel now because we are at the end of our time block. Please, can I ask all of you to congratulate the panelists and the persons who've done their work. Thank you again, and we've concluded this block 6, I think it is. Am I off mic? Good. I think we still have a coffee break. Or no coffee break. There's no coffee break. Hello, hello, hello. Can you listen to me? Okay, now this is on. Good morning. My name is Ivan Zambrana. I am the Executive Director of the Plurinational Authority of Mother Earth, the Bolivian institution in charge of climate change policy. And I will be moderating this session, session 7, on global climate finance architecture from the perspectives of national and subnational actors. As you may recall, we have seen many numbers, especially during the first day of discussions, illustrating how many billions of dollars need to be mobilized in the global climate finance architecture. However, as discussed in the breakout
sorry, as discussed in the breakout groups and plenaries, these resources should be both accessible and should also match the priorities of national, subnational, and local levels. Without this link, abundance of international climate is going to just be a myth. Building on the breakout group discussions held this morning, this session will further explore how global climate finance architecture can generate domestic finance for mitigation and adaptation at the national and subnational levels. During this discussion, we will explore successes and challenges of international climate finance in generating domestic finance, how national policies and domestic investments are aligned with national development strategies, NDCs, and NAPs, and efforts needed to further facilitate the access to international climate finance by diverse stakeholders, including the private sector. Please let me introduce the panel that is going to join us now. We have first Tul Gazgal from Hasbank, Mongolia, who will be invited to deliver a scene-setting presentation to share the experience of Hasbank in blending international and national climate finance. Then we have Hossein Abassa from Egypt. He is currently the senior advisor to the Egyptian Minister of Environment. Prior to holding this position, he has worked for the UNEP and founded the Center for Sustainable Development Solutions to promote sustainable development with a particular focus on Egypt and the Middle East. Then we have Arnold Graves. He is the climate advisor to the Union for the Mediterranean Secretariat. He is a civil engineer of the French Ministry for the Ecological and Inclusive Transition, with 25 years of experience in climate policies. Finally, we have Sung Woo Kim. He is the head of Environment and Energy Research Center at Kim & Chang, the biggest law firm in Korea. And he is an adjunct professor of Korea University. In the past, he was a regional head of climate change and sustainability at KPMG Asia Pacific. Please, I would like to invite Tul to start her presentation, and then we are going to comment on it.
So, should I just sit down there?
As you may want.
So, hello everybody. So, thank you for letting me to introduce you to Hasbank, who we are and what we do. So there should be my presentation. So Hasbank is the Mongolian private commercial bank with the mission of planet, people, and prosperity. And we established the Eco Banking Department in 2009, and this is the business unit which implements the planet mission of the bank. And in 2016, in October 2016, Hasbank was accredited by GCF and became the direct access national implementing entity of the GCF. So in December 2016, our first funding proposal was approved by the GCF board, and it was the business loan program for GHG emission reduction, and $20 million facility they will be dedicated to the Mongolian MSMEs who produce and also who are the end users of the energy efficient and renewable energy products. And the target of this, the GCF facility, it would also should be dispersed, at least 50% of the GCF fund should be dispersed to the business, the women-led MSMEs. And actually, this program was started in 2013 when we first got the fund from a Global Climate Partnership Fund. It was actually the first climate investor who entered to the Mongolia. And right now we have 4 co-financiers, the last one, the GCF. And during the implementation of this program, we actually really understood the one thing: in order to push the businesses, private sectors to do more green projects, we have to support them, and the financing should be kind of support, and we have to leverage the financing. And because of the green solutions and green technologies are quite expensive than the just traditional the solutions on the market. So we just understood we have to offer them more concessionary and with long-term finance. So that's why we aim to be accredited by GCF to have the access to more cheap financing, cheap fund. And after blending GCF fund on that, the program, which is in total $60 million now, we actually really succeeded to meet our target, and right now we actually decreased by 5 points our interest rate to end users, to the end borrowers. And the next program, it is the renewable energy project, and it is about $18.67 million and 10 megawatt solar power plant to be constructed in Char province of Mongolia, and 51% of this total project cost was financed by the project developer, who are also the private entity, and the remaining 49% of the project cost was financed by the GCF as a concessionary loan. And for us, it is also very important to attract the GCF fund and also the International Financial Institutions Fund for those kind of large-scale renewable energy projects, because often GCF finances only up to 50% of the total project cost. So if the project developer needs the debt financing, maybe after 70 or 80% of the total project cost, probably we would need to find out the other international finance institutions to co-finance those large-scale projects. Because in the Mongolia, actually, the local commercial fund is very expensive. Savings interest rate is so high. That's why also the loan interest rate is quite high for those kind of renewable energy large-scale projects. And the third GCF program is, it was actually a simplified approval proposal. I actually expected to have it approved during the last board meeting. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. But anyway, it is completely different than the previous 2 programs. It is the energy efficient consumption loan program dedicated to the Mongolian households. And it has also the component of energy efficient housing. And this program will be, the fund will be blended with the Hasbank's local commercial fund. So after the blending of the GCF fund and our local commercial fund, we believe that we could have the more concessionary interest rate to the households, which we are targeting more low-income households. And there is also the grant component, which is we have also co-financing on the grant, which is GERS, the French NGO, who would help us to make the pre-evaluation and post-evaluation of the retrofitting of existing houses and also the construction of the energy-efficient houses. Thank you.
Thank you, too. Tul has showed us some interesting examples of how in Mongolia they were able to mix international and national private funding to implement different projects more in the mitigation side. I would like to start with Hussein to hear his views about what additional challenges are emerging from these sort of solutions in different countries, including Egypt.
Yeah, well, let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this interesting event. I'd like to share with the audience here the experience Egypt has had with the development of the 2030 Sustainable Development Strategy and how we are trying to streamline, as we do that, climate change considerations into the strategy itself. I mean, Egypt, for the first time, actually, we started developing that strategy and launched it in 2016. And as any strategy, it's subjected to a revision. And we have so many challenges that would, suggest that we need to do this kind of revision, including the structure adjustment program that we're going through. Other challenges like population increase, which is on the high end, I must say, 2.5% annual increase, which is quite high. Other challenges include water issue, water-related issues, and the like. So we started that process almost 6 months ago, led by the Ministry of Planning. But we have, in doing that, we have engaged a wide stakeholder consultation process, which included private sector, NGOs, youth, women, marginalized communities. We needed to make sure that all stakeholders are really brought on board in this consultation process. What we needed to ensure in that exercise, and that I think we touched upon since yesterday and today, is demonstrating the benefits really of moving onto or shifting onto a sustainable development path or investing in green sectors. And that is actually one of the main sort of emphasis we laid on the revision process, that we needed to have ministries and other stakeholders understand the linkages between investing in the environment and investing in human resources and the economic returns emanating from that, including enhanced competitiveness, of course, and that is achieved through more efficiency in the use of natural resources, be it water, energy, or other factor inputs. The use of renewable resources of energy, water, and other, like waste recycling and the like. And the impact this would have on enhanced competitiveness and increasing market access, and of course, creating new market opportunities, new investment opportunities, and creating jobs, and of course, taking care of the environment. And I must emphasize here really because I was, most of you may know that I was engaged in the launching of the UNEP Green Economy Initiative. And one of the main premises which lies behind that was not emphasizing the environment per se, because once we've been doing this since the launch of UNEP, it didn't gain traction as we have hoped, because we emphasized environment in isolation from economic development and economic-related issues, and hence, repackaging our communication sort of package and putting it in a framework where policymakers would really understand more and would appreciate the link between environment and social aspects, be it job creation and improving health, and at the same time improving the economic or enhancing economic prospects of the country. And this is what we have emphasized in the current process, linkage between the social, economic, and environmental dimensions in achieving sustainable development. And, I'd like to even move a step further. It's not just simply linking the social or integrating social, economic, environment. I go a step further and looking at it from investing in the environment and human resources as an entry point for achieving sustainable development, rather than the other way around. Because if we keep on saying integration, at the end of the day, economics take precedence, and environment and the social aspects, take a back seat. But I must say here that through that revisiting process, I think we've managed through that to gain the attention of people working in ministries to the importance of investing in these two main dimensions, as I said, the human aspect and the natural resource aspect, in achieving the objectives of their respective line ministries, whether it be tourism, agriculture, industry, or the like. So it's not simply trying to push something down the throat of governments or private sector or NGOs, but rather making the economic and business case of shifting that. I mean, we've been talking about changing the paradigm shift, but if we don't demonstrate that in real terms, then it's very difficult to keep on pursuing that objective and trying to insist that this is the way to proceed. So I do believe that through that process that we have started, I would say, 6 months back in ensuring this engagement of the different stakeholders, and in particular the government, is gaining traction here. One maybe last point I'd like to make is that it's not simply, and I've been saying this all along, and even not just in Egypt, but in other forums like this, it's not simply or only the responsibility of the government to achieve sustainable development and mainstreaming the climate change issues in the different policies, but it is a collective effort involving the private sector, NGOs, youth, women, and without the collaborative effort of all these stakeholders to make that shift and realizing the importance of addressing not just climate change issues, environmental issues, and the linkage between climate issues and other conventions like Biodiversity Convention, Ozone Convention, and so on, then we're not going that far. So I'd like to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sungwoo Kim, I think that we can all agree that it's easier to bring the private sector to the table with the promise of revenue and return. But how can we persuade the involvement of the private sector, especially at the national level, when the benefits do not come only at the bottom line, but the benefits sometimes are shared and are enjoyed by the whole community, and as we know, the whole planet?
Thank you. That's a very good question, and that's the question that I have been asked for last decade. I'm a private sector guy, and I'm climate investment specialist from private sector perspective. So I'm the one who advised the Korean government to host Green Climate Fund into Korea from private sector's perspective, and I'm the one who advised the Korean government to design carbon policy and carbon pricing scheme from private sector's perspective. But it's been in Korea, we have hosted the Green Climate Fund, we have studied the emission trading scheme as a second country globally since 2015. And we announced the climate, the greenhouse gas, the roadmap last week, asking the private sector to reduce the 20% of greenhouse gas in 2030. So that's a big target. But still, there is a gap between the public sector and private sector. And let me just go by it. The gap is not narrowing down, to be afraid, if I may, at least for this country. There are 3 reasons that the private sector, at least in this country, do not invest in climate projects. The first one, the projects are too small in comparison with alternative investment area that private sector can find. It could be shipbuilding, could be airplane lease, could be any other acquisition of any food company. So project is small. That's number 1 reason. Number 2 reason is the target country that private sector is supposed to invest in. That's the countries that the private sector are not familiar with, and that's why they don't want to invest in that kind of countries. Rather, they want to invest in United States or developed country, et cetera, et cetera. Third reason is the private sector needs a loan of, say, 100 million or 1 million within 3 months. So that's the speed that, from my perspective, having advised the private sector and public sector, that's the speed that public sector, I don't think they can really do something about it. 3 months, it's too short. It's not lazy, but it's short because there are processes that you have to go through. So these are the 3 gaps that I have found so far as a challenge. I can give you lots of examples that I brought the small 1 million project, the 10 million project in Africa, solar farm, to one of the top conglomerate in Korea, and they told me it's too small. And I also introduced one, the big Indian, the solar panel project to one of the top 5, the conglomerate CEO, and they said India is not the country they want to invest in. This is real. I mean, that's like last year's happening. And yesterday, some of the investor, some of the developer told me that he wants to invest. He wants some investment for his Indonesian geothermal project, and he needs some loan within 3 months. So these are all the challenges that I'm facing so far. But I think the main reason is, as I said, speed and high transaction costs due to the small project and high country risk, that they're combined of the perceived risk and real risk. But recently, what I meant by recently is like last 6 months, something has been a little bit changed. These are all related to the role of climate finance at the end, but recently the private sectors are certainly partially interested in small project, interested in the low-income country project, and have a little bit more patient for the speed to get the loan. The biggest reason for that is the carbon pricing offset system that Korea has just introduced. So what I'm saying here is it's very hard for climate finance to change private sector's mind to invest in this area, but it's a little bit easier if you can combine this with carbon pricing mechanism, so that if the investors have some obligation to meet, to reduce the carbon, and if that's a mandatory, then they have to look for some project to get some offset, no matter they like it or not. I think that's a good starting point to redirect the attention of private sector who are only interested in the bottom line when they make a decision of investment. We have to, I think we have to understand, they actually, the private sector they care, but they do not incorporate the community's benefit into their decision making. They care, but they don't incorporate. So I think we have to all understand that. So I think that my suggestion is, as I have witnessed Korean investors, the behavior change, I think that carbon policing offset system can actually initiate the private sector's attention to this field, which we need some financing from private sector. Just one last sharing that I would like to do is having advised Korean government as well from private sector's perspective. There are some conflicts of interest among line industries. There is a conflict of interest between the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Industry. So if you, as a climate finance, because you do a lot of capacity buildings and you help the developing countries to build the enabling framework and environment, I think it's, from my country's experience, it's very important to have good attention from presidential office, who really assigned all the ministers, rather than the minister or vice minister of one ministry or the strong ministry, etc., etc. That's the experience from Korea. So to wrap up, I think that for the private sector, the climate policy, climate pricing mechanism, and climate investment should be well combined and linked to stimulate the private sector's investment. That's number one. Number two, to align the ministries of conflict of interest, you should tackle the presidential office. So I think my suggestion would be, as an advisor for Korean government and private sector for last 7 years, I think that for developing countries, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I suggest you watch very closely what kind of trials and errors that we went through, so that you can avoid that trials and errors, and you can improve even faster than Korea. I'll just stop here and to go back.
Thank you. Well, yes, indeed, it's sometimes you can see an overlap and sometimes a conflict in the interests of different sectors, especially the industrial, the productive sector, and the environmental sector. But sometimes it's because they don't realize that the national priorities regarding climate change are the responsibility of all of them, not just the responsibility of the environmental sector. So that's why, for me, it's very interesting to realize the name of the Ministry of Ecological and Just Transition in France. I think it's a good opportunity of portraying the idea that the transition is not something that has to be carried out just by a subset of the state or by a subset of the population, but by the whole nation or the whole state. So in your experience, Mr. Graves, what is the biggest challenge in trying to bring everybody towards the same goal regarding the investment at the national level in climate action?
Thanks a lot for the invitation. I would like first to introduce the organization, the Union for the Mediterranean. It's an international, intergovernmental organization gathering 43 countries of the European and the Mediterranean region. It has been created 10 years ago, so it's still a quite young organization. And it is now really active in climate action since 2014, when the first ministerial on environment and climate change has been adopted. And from then, climate change expert group, a regional climate change expert group that has been created with all member countries being represented. And from them, a work program has been adopted with 4 main activities, including climate finance. This activity has led to a publication of a first study last year that we have shared with the countries and during the COP23 in Bonn. So this help in enhancing cooperation between the countries. And as the UFM is a northern and southern organization, it's a very good place to enhance cooperation between the northern and southern countries in the framework of the Paris Agreement. We also created a regional climate finance committee where we invite IFIs and development agencies in order to strengthen the cooperation at the regional level. And we also share this information with the focal points of our climate change expert groups in order to facilitate the access to the climate finance. Furthermore, I would like to also say that we, of course, use the fact that the European Union is part of the co-presidency, along with the Jordan Kingdom. And this also facilitates access to some cooperation program. We will soon start a new program for 4 years in which cooperation on preparation of NDCs is included, as well as climate finance access, and finally the preparation of national and subnational climate finance. So I think from that experience, the main point here to answer your question is really the cooperation. At the regional level, I think we have here a good example of what can be done between northern and southern country regarding climate action.
Thank you. As you can tell, there is different challenges that emerge from taking a look at this issue from the different perspectives that have something to say at the national level. And at the same time, obviously, we cannot generalize one single set of approaches to the all different national circumstances. I would like to propose to the whole panel a question that is actually related to this. How can we ensure that domestic finance, as scaled up by international finance, can reconcile both the priorities set up by the national climate finance strategies, NDCs, NAPs, and the particular specific agendas of different international finance sources? Yeah.
So as an accredited entity, we closely work with the countries' NDA, the national designated authorities. on each funding proposal, even the readiness support application or PPF application, we have to get the no objection letter from the NDA office. So it is very crucial to review whether our activities or project or programs we are planning to invest finance is in line with the country's national determined contributions. For instance, our business loan program for GHG emission reduction, it is in line with the country's INDC target of 14% emission reduction. And the renewable energy program, for instance, it will contribute to the country's target to reach the 20% of the renewable energy by 2020 and 30% by 2030. And the last one is, for instance, it is in line with the INGC target of 40% of reduction of building heat loss. So it is very important to us to know whether these programs or projects we planning to finance is in line with the country's INDC.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite any questions that the floor has. Yes, please, there.
Thank you. My name's Erin Roberts. I'm from the Overseas Development Institute, and I have a question for Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim, you talked about Korea's really taking a leadership role in aligning climate change policies and investment, and I wondered, you talked about other countries can learn from Korea's experience. I wondered how other countries can learn. So what kind of outputs are you planning to produce? Could you prepare a synthesis of your experiences, or given our capacity building discussion earlier today, could Korea become an incubator, bringing focal points or decision makers from other countries to Korea to learn from your experiences? I wonder if you could speak about that a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, Bernarditas.
Ayman's not here, so the co-chair can talk. No, I was just wondering, also for Mr. Kim, it's very interesting how he sees that the private sector can be incentivized to do this. And you spoke about carbon pricing and offsets. That is an encouragement for the private sector to get engaged in climate change. What do you mean by offsets? Because offsets for us really are not very, they do not contribute to addressing the problem. And then the second question also from Mr. Kim, and I think you alluded a bit to it, is the role of public regulatory frameworks, because the private sector in some way is also how to say, there's regulation, there's rule of the private sector by the public, by the government. Is there a role for the government to incentivize the private sector, and what kind of public regulatory framework would be necessary for that to be done? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe the last one here.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Kim, for thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kim. Thank all the speakers. You have been very frank, actually, talking about the private sector, but you are also in a very unique position, given the experience you've had. In addition to the question that was, the first question that was asked, I would like to observe the following, that your private sector is different from other countries' private sectors. You said that the cost of transaction is high, etc. You give the impression that there is a reticence on the part of the private sector, that they are not willing to change some of their rules, even with the assurance from the Green Climate Fund so far that risks are there, yes, but they can be managed, and there is a risk management framework. It's evolving. It's not finalized yet in the fund. And I wonder whether, once we have this done, whether this will be enough enticement for the private sector to be attracted to work with developing countries on climate projects. They will be unconventional. Some will be small, some will be large. And at least in the region that you are very familiar with. But you have been honest in saying that it's resistant, the private sector. And we have been told over and over and over again, the private sector is there, they have more flexibility, they can go to these dormant funds, the pension funds, the sovereign funds, etc., trillions of dollars. We all know this. But countries, especially in the South, are not really willing to change the rules, the regulations, their priorities, especially their priorities, in order to accommodate the foreign private sector. Is there a midpoint that we can meet? Thank you.
Yeah, the last, for the sake of time, the last question, please.
Yeah, well, it's actually a comment, and then I'm sure I would invite comments from whoever wants to comment. My question relates to the issue of NDCs and how they are aligned with the national priorities and the requirements that come from the international level. If you recall, the NDCs were actually, the precursor to that was the INDC. And many of us recognized, and this is a reality that I'm not sure how many of you realize, that when the developing countries were asked to contribute, put on the table their INDCs, and there was a rush to do this before the Paris Agreement got nailed down, one of the things that we heard was that many consultants were coming into countries and doing the INDCs for the countries. And a number of countries actually did not realize what the content of the NDCs were, because they were not driving the process. And many of them were, and this is a reality. While we talk about country ownership, country drivenness, and we do understand from the discussion that this is challenging, but when you have international, driving institutions or processes which come to impose at the national level a quick process of a very challenging kind, where what you actually are asking is for all sectors to be transformed, for adaptation, risk assessment, everything we discussed earlier in a breakout group, how you actually are talking about a complete economic change. If we are really, committed to climate change, then it is really something that is totally across the sectors and across everything. And it's something that we have never done before. So in a lot of ways, it's hugely challenging. But in this process where you have consultants coming and doing NDCs, and then you find that, oh my God, what did we do here? You begin to realize that there will be a mismatch. There will be a disconnect. There will be a lack of achievement. So the point I'm driving is that while international institutions, I think what's important is having to enable and incentivize and motivate national action in a way that actually encourages and enables, rather than a process which is a shortcut. Because this is not about a shortcut. And I think the more that countries actually are in the driver's seat and own the process, rather than consultants and foreign institutions, the more we will be able to achieve what we commit to. And I think that's a very important lesson.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe strategically we can react to the last comment first and then go to Mr. Kim's response. If anybody has any reaction to it. Well, just to add up to what she said, I think it's important to realize that because, for example, the NDC partnership just had a mission in Bolivia, and they brought 3 very smart mitigation experts, which doesn't make sense because Bolivia doesn't have a mitigation NDC. So sometimes you can find that, and I'm sure that that could be a problem when trying to match international finance with the national willingness to direct financing to the right climate action set of initiatives. Mr. Kim, please.
Thank you for so many questions to private sector. As I said, I'm not representing all the private sector globally, but I think I can reflect some ideas of Korean the private sector's investors. I think all questions are very related. So let me put it this way. I think that the lessons that I have learned and that I want to share with the other part of the world is we do have a good experience to balance the interest of different stakeholders among the society to build up carbon policy and carbon pricing and climate financing in this society. We are still building up. I'm not saying that we succeeded in all harmony yet, but we do have some good lessons that you can benchmark. And let me just give you one example, if I have a time, but maybe example can be, like for ETS, I think it's very important to align the industrial structure when you benchmark some jurisdictions. So I think for all developing countries which have a similar industrial structure, you can benchmark Korea and our lessons. And the offset thing is, the Korean government just allowed from this year in emission trading scheme to allow international credit to be able to use for domestic compliance, 5%, 10% of with certain limitation. That's why the private sector are eagerly start to looking at the foreign project, although they are slow, although it's small, although it's for low-income countries. So I'm not saying that carbon pricing and offset scheme is silver bullet, but I'm saying that could be one of the options that you can consider to redirect the attention from private sector to this area. And the GCF, I just want to close my remark by saying this: private sector is not one single entity. Financial institutions have very, very different criteria of investment than corporates. So there are diverse sets of private sector. You have to segment private sector, and you have to decide which one to invite. For the GCF, I think now I understand. When I first time 10 years ago, when I first time to advise the World Bank and GCF as a private sector, it's very hard for me to understand its mechanism. But now I understand it takes time to to do something. So I know you are doing a good job as a GCF, but it takes time. I think I'm pretty optimistic you're going to be successful, but the time horizon would be a little bit different from the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just to wrap things a little bit, well, before I do that, do any one of you want to make some final comments? Well, if not, I think we have an unintended emphasis in the private sector, but I think it's still relevant to discuss it because sometimes we see the private sector as a wholly different animal, but they are still part of the population of each country, and they should be subjected to all the responsibilities and the commitments that the country has made in order to contribute to the overall goal of the Paris Agreement. And it's important that we can use incentives. I think they are necessary, but they are not enough. Sometimes you need also strong governments to not just invite the private sector in a direction, but command the private sector in that direction. And that's especially important when we are talking about how to scale up national level financing, because obviously governments cannot do everything. Foreign investment is also part of the climate finance architecture, but we also need responsible investment from the side of the private sector, I think. And we should look into all these different approaches that are emerging and see what the lessons can be drawn from their implementation. Finally, I would like to thank all the members of the panel for this opportunity of discussing this important issue, and I would like to ask for a round of applause for them. I think that the Secretariat may want to announce some housekeeping issues, and with this, I would like to end this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. So the lunch will be served in the Sheraton Hotel, the same place that we had lunch yesterday. You're requested to return to the plenary at 2 p.m. sharp. Thank you.